In 2014, Peter Ho, a senior advisor working in the Center for Strategic Futures in Singapore, begins a speech to the public sector with a reference to the 2009 cinematic reboot of Star Trek. In the scene, he describes the young James Kirk as a cadet in the Starfleet Academy going through a simulation exercise called the Kobayashi Maru. The Kobayashi Maru is infamous for being impossible to defeat. Yet Kirk manages to be the first to do so by secretly reprogramming the test. Later on, when Spock, the designer of the simulation, accuses the cadet of cheating, Kirk argues that cheating is justified because the system is unfair to begin with. Spock retorts that Kirk had failed to understand the point of the exercise. He tells him the following.
The purpose is to experience fear. Fear in the face of certain death, to accept that fear, and maintain control of oneself and one's crew. This is a quality expected in every Starfleet captain.
Ho uses the excerpt to make the point that in today's complex and dynamic systems, the future has become impossible to codify and master. Instead, we must learn to face the future in all its uncertainty, including the ultimate uncertainty of a certain death. Deprived of an objective set of formulas to predict the future, one must learn to read and unread the horizon at the same time. An exercise not just in making sense, but also in sense-making. As Ho elaborates, sense-making is not about the truth and getting it right. Rather, it consists in the continuous drafting and redrafting of an emerging story. With this, no longer are we talking about the false certitudes of probability and prediction. Instead, we partake in what can only be called a speculative aesthetics, where the horizon, instead of being seen as an object of human mastery, comes to mark the limit of the human and its exposure to the radical uncertainty of what is to come. So let's go back to the old Western films in which the future was first imagined as an unoccupied landscape to be mapped. Envisioned as an unknown country that was not just out there, but waiting to be discovered by man. The future was a destination that, however distant, was ultimately reachable by way of passing through the land. What the sight of the barren landscape provided was the assurance that as unknowable as the future may be, its availability was no longer in question. Such was the logic of the frontier driving the relentless charge towards the west. And so persistent was its forward rush that anything that obstructed its path had to be both symbolically and physically eliminated. Signs of prior occupation were either rendered invisible or illicit, posed as a problem to be resolved by the narrative, such that the film ends with the clearing of the horizon as the space into which the heroes must proceed. The frontier imaginary gazed upon the emptiness of a landscape that was off its own production. It was above all a mode of unmapping the land. Today, the horizon as its space of knowledge and mastery has collapsed. This is a condition symptomatic of a world where, following first the 9/11 attacks, and then the securitization crisis of 2008, and if I may add, recent events, all manners of approaching the future based on probability and prediction have been suspended. But the irony is that the mediation of this traumatic loss through, on the one hand, the security state, and on the other, the propulsive engine of capital, continues to demand the reconstruction of the horizon as a precarious object of vision/knowledge, as if to at once reinforce our sense of vulnerability and reclaim from it some shred of agency. In fact, one could say that such a condition is already present in the Western. For sure, the Western, broadly speaking, follows a narrative of mastery. But to think of it purely as such is to miss the moments of suspension, the moments when the heroes and villains alike stop moving and start looking. As much as the Western is built around scenes of cavalry and gunfighting, it is also a genre very much about the experience of vision. In it, we find ourselves looking towards the horizon, but also looking at others doing the looking, just as they themselves are looking at others doing so. An economy of looking gathers around the limit space of the horizon, a space where one can truly never know what might come at you, where you keep on looking even when there is nothing to look at. The Western hero can never see far enough. In our present paradigm, the horizon as a space of anticipation and anxiety, opportunity and threat appears on our screens. The contemporary Western is set not in the dusty frontier towns, but within the metropolis itself, spread across boardrooms and climate-controlled offices of data analysts and hedge fund managers. It is a world marked by an explosion of data, to which our initial response was simply to build models, supported by complex formulas devised to calculate and manage our exposure to that which defies calculation. Such models smooth out the ruggedness of the landscape in which one operates, and in so doing, makes us even more oblivious to the crisis that is fermenting in the crevices. Indeed, for the post-crash analyst, it is the irregularities or the weak signals that matter. Within this new anxiety-ridden speculative complex, no longer can one make a clear distinction between signal and noise. One has to look at everything that falls within the field of vision. One has to become a horizon scanner. It was on this premise that the Risk Assessment and Horizon Scanning Program, in short RAH, was launched in 2004 in Singapore. From the outset, this program may appear to be just another state-run big data program. As the story goes, the idea for the program came about in a meeting that Peter Ho, then the Permanent Secretary for Defense, had in October 2002 with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, in the US. Ho had traveled to meet John Poindexter, one of DARPA's senior directors, to learn more about a data mining program that his office was building under the name Total Information Awareness. Developed as a counter-terror weapon, TIA was designed to collect large amounts of electronic data to be analyzed for suspicious activity. Inspired, the civil servant went on to pilot a similar program in Singapore when the SARS regional outbreak, several months later, provided the crisis required to retroactively put the program to the test. So by feeding the program with the public data that was available in the months preceding the outbreak, the ministry wanted to know if they could have possibly preempted its occurrence. The results proved incredibly encouraging. And from that was born the RAH program that would, over the years, extend its scope beyond national security to all levels of governance. The common tendency of the liberal commentator is to see this program through the figure of the surveillance state. But in doing so, one misunderstands its fundamental premise. Indeed, the RAH program can be better described as a tech-enabled speculative narrative economy, where the central element of the apparatus is not the algorithm, but the analyst interpreting the data. The key concept here is the black swan, which, as most of you may be familiar with, is a term coined by the risk analyst Nassim Taleb to describe rare, unpredictable events of great consequence that are rationalized only in hindsight. The provocation of Taleb's concept is that all existing models of approaching the future based on probability and prediction had to be overturned. For simply relying on established patterns or dominant trends is not just inadequate, but also dangerous. Readers of Taleb's book will notice that it is animated by a seeming paradox, that as much as we cannot predict the occurrence of black swans, we can somehow prepare for them. Likewise, this is what informs the architects of the RAH program, who insist that the program does not foretell discrete events, but picks up weak signals that may or may not mean anything at all. The technological interface is not a silver bullet, but a virtual environment bringing together a community of analysts to generate narratives that are then elaborated upon or picked apart. Notably, its original name was the Surprise Anticipation Center, a name that brings to mind not virile cowboys training their gaze upon the horizon, but more a gang of nervous meerkats perking up their bodies so as to stretch their range of vision. Within this framework, the horizon scanner is the complete antithesis of the expert. In fact, the whole point of the technology is to help to counteract the biases of the expert, whose years of specialist training leads him to recognize some patterns at the expense of everything else. So instead of picking out the signals from the noise, the program generates an economy of noise on the basis of which the analyst produces his narratives. To this end, the issue here concerns not metadata, but something more like metaphysics. How else can one describe the condition of these, in many ways, disempowered analysts straining their bodies at the limits of the knowable? And how exactly can one possibly train for this impossible undertaking of anticipating surprise, or, if I may, anticipating one's failure to fully anticipate? To get a concrete sense of what this speculative labor exactly entails, let's focus on the word narrative that often crops up. What's important to note here is that narrative refers not to the grand narratives that we are so familiar with, but something much more provisional, pieced together from data fragments. For it is often only in these bits and pieces where one can get a sense of the emergent, with which the analyst can begin to tell his story. As Aaron Maniam, an analyst with the Singapore government, puts it, the key tools of futurecraft today are no longer maps, but metaphors. As he says, maps cannot be made for things, issues, and places that do not already exist. For the unknown and or not yet knowable, we need different tools. I find it useful to take a leaf from creative writers, particularly poets, and mine the insights that come from the world of metaphors. With this, let's consider seriously some of the metaphors in this foresight glossary produced by the Center for Strategic Futures in Singapore. We've already learned of the black swan, so now here are its various cousins. First, we have the gray swan, also invented by Nassim Taleb, and is used to describe an event similar to the black swan, but is predictable to a certain degree, with some warning signs. Examples would include earthquakes. Then there is the dirty white swan, invented by Scott Ryrie. So unlike a black swan, the dirty white swan is only surprising because of dirty cognitive biases. So the example that the glossary gives is the 2011 Brisbane floods. There is also the red swan proposed by Gordon Wu, used to describe an event predicted to have catastrophic effects, but is actually a red herring that is not impactful. The examples given are the Y2K bug and mad cow disease. Finally, there is the Dragon King by Didier Sonnet, which refers to an event which is only unpredictable because it starts to behave very differently when it has reached a certain scale, the best example being a financial bubble. So just considering the menagerie that we have here, we are already seeing some truly peculiar animal spirits. And I use this term not for a strict meaning in market economics, but to suggest the shape-shifting qualities of these shamanistic metaphors, such that a black swan can easily morph into a gray swan, a dirty white swan, a red swan, or even a dragon king. The end of one metaphor begetting another. Story after story cluster around the horizon. The new futures analyst is the relentless storyteller. With this, we start to see a strange animism creeping into the space of computerized speculation, and likewise a humanism in the form of the storyteller whose role is to pastoralize these monsters. As the policymakers repeatedly emphasize, the point is to put the human back into the machine. And so incessant is this refrain, that one starts to wonder what exactly defines this human that is so casually invoked. This human that appears to be paradoxically both empowered and disempowered, both controlling and controlled by data that has truly gone wild. So as I read more of these foresight literature, I came to a rather startling realization. As it turns out, this vision of the human as proposed comes very close to what many of us in this room would recognize as the contemporary artist. By this, I'm talking about the artist as the amateur, the non-expert, the conceptualist who has abandoned any claim to virtuosity. The artist who's not just unafraid to say that he's simply human, but further transforms this limiting condition into an art. That is, the art of being simply human. This is an art that involves coming up with metaphors for that which has no metaphor, according to which metaphoricity becomes for the human analyst both its limit and its condition for transcendence. With this, not only does the human become a supplement to the machine, he also becomes the supplement to the human. The human is the best safeguard against the machine and against himself. The question then is if this supplemental space of contingency can truly enable us to partake in the poetics of being simply human as we generate new stories about our individual and collective futures. Or does it come to be recaptured by a political economy that privileges some narratives while extinguishing others, according to which certain weak signals are once again disregarded as noise, simply because the crises to which they point are not taken as crises at all, until it is far too late. On 27th August this year, the first confirmed case of Zika infection was reported in Singapore. By the end of the week, that figure ballooned to 258. By all standards, the sudden surge was alarming, immediately raising concerns in the region of an increased rate of transmission. But in Singapore, just as the fogging operations commenced in the identified clusters, the word on the ground was of an initial cover-up by the government. This much was suggested by the fact that a week before the announcement of the first infection, the ministry had already been alerted to an unusual concentration of fever cases in one neighborhood, notably involving a large number of migrant laborers working at a particular construction site. Yet, as tempting as it may be to postulate from this that the information was being withheld, I wonder if this was more of a case of a crisis failing to be recognized as such because its weak signals were taken as interferences so banal that we have managed to live with them in semi-awareness. After all, construction sites in Singapore are notorious for being mosquito breeding grounds, and the lives that toil within them so devalued that they can be said to be always already in crisis. So much so that even if the symptoms were present, chances are that the infected workers would have had been contagious for weeks before they finally brought themselves to consult the doctor, fearing recriminations from their employers. To this end, these so-called weak signals are not simply premonitions of a big shattering crisis to come. They are the crisis itself in its ongoing banality. Under such conditions of the crisis ordinary, there is no climax to make a compelling narrative, only a fog of indifference against which stories of ongoing crisis struggle to be heard. In this time of horizon scanning, what then remains as the more pertinent question is not that of what stories are being told, but of who is doing the listening. Thank you.